Welcome to Scoli Sleep Stories. Before we begin, take a moment to get comfortable. Let the day soften around you and settle in for a calm documentary made for curious minds. If these stories help you rest, learn, or simply enjoy a quieter part of the day, please consider liking this episode and subscribing to the channel. Now, when you are ready, let us begin. Chapter 1. A Quiet Beginning in the Highlands. In the highlands of Ethiopia, morning often arrives softly. Mist gathers in the folds of the hills, resting for a while among trees and grasses before the sun grows warm enough to lift it away. The air is cool and clear. Birds call from hidden branches. Footpaths curve through green slopes past shaded forest edges and small clearings where leaves shine with the dampness of dawn. Here in these uplands of northeastern Africa, the story of coffee has one of its quiet beginnings. Long before coffee was poured into cups in distant cities, long before it traveled by ship across seas, it was a plant of the highland forest. One of the most important coffee plants in the world, Coffea arabica, is native to Ethiopia and nearby regions. Coffea arabica is the species behind much of the coffee people drink today. A species is simply a kind of living thing, and arabica is one kind of coffee plant, often suited to cooler mountain climates. In its wild form, coffee did not begin as a neatly planted crop. It likely grew among other trees, under shade in places where the mountain air was gentle and the soil held enough moisture. Its leaves were glossy and deep green. Its small white blossoms appeared for a time with a delicate fragrance. And after the flowers came the fruit, round, smooth coffee cherries, ripening from green to red. A coffee cherry is the fruit of the coffee plant. Inside each cherry are seeds. Those seeds are what we usually call coffee beans. They are not beans in the same sense as lentils or peas, but seeds hidden inside a fruit. In the beginning, before roasting and grinding, before brewing and serving, coffee was simply part of the living landscape, a shrub among many shrubs, bearing red fruit in the filtered light of the forest. It is easy to imagine that people who live near these plants came to know them slowly. Human knowledge often begins that way, not with a single sudden moment, but with careful noticing repeated over generations. Someone sees birds eating the fruit. Someone tastes the sweet outer pulp. Someone observes that animals return to the same shrubs when the cherries are ripe. Someone else remembers where the plants grow best, which slopes hold them, and which seasons bring them into color. The history of coffee is sometimes introduced through a famous tale, the legend of Kaldi. In this story, Kaldi is an Ethiopian goatherd. He watches his goats nibble the red cherries from a certain shrub, and afterward, they seem unusually lively. Curious, he tries the fruit himself, or brings it to others, and in this way, coffee begins its journey into human use. It is a charming story, and it has been told many times. Like many legends, it offers a picture that people can easily remember: green hills, red cherries, lively goats, and a careful herder watching the habits of his animals. A legend is a traditional story. It may hold cultural meaning, and it may preserve something of how people think about the past, but it is not the same as a dated written record. Kaldi may or may not have been a real person. The story appears later in coffee's history, and historians do not treat it as proof of coffee's first discovery. It is better to hear it as a gentle doorway into the subject, rather than as a firm beginning. The plant's origin and the drink's documented history are not exactly the same. The coffee plant, especially Coffea arabica, is strongly linked to the Ethiopian highlands. But the earliest reliable written evidence for coffee drinking as a beverage comes later, across the Red Sea in Yemen during the 15th century. There, coffee appears in records connected with communities who used it as a drink. This does not mean Ethiopia was unimportant in the human story of coffee. Far from it. Ethiopia has deep coffee traditions, including coffee ceremonies in which beans are roasted, ground, brewed, and shared with care. These ceremonies are an important part of hospitality and social life in many Ethiopian communities. Their exact age is difficult to determine because not every tradition leaves an early written record. Some customs are carried in households, in memory, in practice, and in the repeated gestures of daily life. So we begin with both certainty and humility. We can say that wild coffee belongs to these highland regions. We can say that people in Ethiopia have long known coffee as part of life and culture. We can also say that the first clear written records of coffee drinking come from Yemen in the 15th century. Between the living plant in the forest and the written page in Yemen lies a wide, quiet space of human attention, movement, and experiment. In that space, coffee was not yet the familiar dark drink known around the world. It was a fruit on a shrub. It was a seed inside a cherry. It was something noticed, tasted, carried, and remembered. The Ethiopian highlands themselves help us understand why the plant flourished there. Coffee Arabica prefers certain conditions: mild temperatures, moisture, shade, and elevation. Highland forests can offer these things. The trees overhead soften the sunlight. Fallen leaves enrich the soil. Mist and seasonal rain bring water. The slopes provide drainage, so the roots are not left standing in too much wetness. Under such conditions, coffee could grow quietly for ages, part of a larger web of plants, insects, birds, and people. Its cherries ripened in their own time. A branch might carry green fruit, yellowing fruit, and deep red fruit together, each at a different stage. The ripest cherries held a gentle sweetness in the outer flesh, while the seeds inside contained the compounds that would later make coffee so valued. One of those compounds is caffeine. Caffeine is a natural substance in the plant. It can help people feel more awake. For the coffee plant, it may also help protect leaves and seeds from some insects. In time, human beings would learn to recognize its effect, but at the beginning, there was only the plant and the slow gathering of experience around it. The earliest human uses of coffee are not fully known. There may have been many ways of using the fruit and seeds before the familiar brewed drink developed. Some people may have chewed the cherries, others may have used the leaves or seeds in simple preparations. These possibilities belong to the next part of the story. For now, we can remain a little longer in the place where the plant itself grew wild. Imagine a shaded forest edge in the highlands. The trunks of trees are darkened by morning moisture. Ferns and grasses grow near the path. The coffee shrubs stand beneath taller branches, their leaves smooth and reflective. A few white blossoms linger here and there, while clusters of red cherries rest close to the stems. A person walking through such a place might not think of trade routes, coffeehouses, porcelain cups, or the long future of this plant. They might see only fruit ripening in the cool air. They might pause, reach out and roll a cherry gently between their fingers. They might notice its color and weight. They might remember that this shrub bore fruit last season too. That kind of remembering is part of history, even when it is not written down. History is often told through kings, merchants, ships, and cities. Coffee will meet all of those in time. It will cross the Red Sea. It will be cultivated on terraced hillsides in Yemen. It will be carried through ports, poured in coffeehouses, debated by scholars, planted across empires, and prepared in kitchens around the world. But before all of that, coffee was rooted in mountain soil. It belonged to mist, shade, and patient growth. It belonged to the quiet knowledge of people who lived near it and learned its seasons. It belonged to the red cherries that appeared among glossy leaves, waiting to be noticed. And so the story begins not with a single discovery, but with a landscape: green highlands, soft birdsong, cool morning air, and a wild plant whose small seeds would one day travel further than anyone standing there could have imagined. For now, the cherries ripen quietly. Their skins deepen from green to red. Within them, the seeds rest in the sweet fruit, holding the beginning of many possible uses. In the next part of the journey, those cherries and seeds will move from forest plant toward human food, ritual, and drink, as people slowly explore what coffee might become. Chapter 2: From Forest Berry to Shared Drink. Before coffee was a dark drink poured into cups, before it was roasted in shops or ground in kitchens, it was first a fruit growing quietly on a branch. In the shaded highlands of northeastern Africa, coffee plants carried small, rounded cherries that ripened from green to yellow and then to a deep red. A coffee cherry is the fruit of the coffee plant. Inside it are the seeds, usually two, pressed gently face to face. These seeds are what people later came to call coffee beans. Long before anyone knew the bean as something to roast and brew, people living near the plant would have known the fruit in a more direct way. They would have seen when it ripened. They would have noticed which birds or animals were drawn to it. They may have tasted the sweet outer flesh, thin but pleasant, with the seed held inside. In such places, knowledge often grew slowly, through seasons of watching, gathering, and remembering. We do not know exactly how the first people used coffee. The earliest chapters of its human story were not written down at the time. They belong to local habit, family memory, and practical experiment. A plant might be tried as food, as a leaf for steeping, or as a seed to be dried and stored. Over time, small discoveries could become customs, and customs could travel from one group of people to another. Some traditions suggest that coffee cherries, or the seeds inside them, may have been eaten before coffee was brewed as a beverage. In some tellings, the seeds or fruit were mixed with fat to make a kind of sustaining food. Such a mixture could have been useful for people moving across hills, tending animals, or traveling from place to place. It is best to speak of this gently, as a possibility preserved in later tradition, rather than as a proven first step. Still, it gives us a quiet picture of coffee before the cup, not yet a drink of steam and aroma, but a small fruit gathered by hand and carried along a path. The plant also offered leaves. In some regions, coffee leaves have been used to make infusions. An infusion is a drink made by steeping plant material, such as leaves, seeds, or roots, in hot water. Many cultures have made infusions from local plants, learning which leaves were fragrant, which were soothing, and which brought a feeling of wakefulness. Coffee leaves, like coffee seeds, contain natural compounds that can affect the body. Their use reminds us that coffee's history did not begin with one single method. It was a plant with several possible gifts. The quality most noticed in coffee was its ability to encourage alertness. This comes mainly from caffeine, a natural stimulant found in the coffee plant. A stimulant is something that can help people feel more awake. Caffeine is not unique to coffee. It also appears in tea leaves, cacao, and some other plants. But in coffee, it became part of the drink's identity. People may have felt that coffee helped them stay attentive during work, conversation, travel, or devotion. In early times, this effect would not have been described with modern chemistry. It would simply have been known through experience. A certain fruit, leaf, or seed seemed to bring wakefulness. At some point, people began to dry the seeds. Drying made them easier to keep. Seeds spread in the sun would slowly lose moisture, resting on mats, stones, or hard earth. The red fruit would be removed in one way or another, and the pale seeds inside would become something that could be stored, carried, and traded. This was an important, quiet change. A fresh cherry belonged to its season. A dried seed could travel beyond it. Perhaps some seeds were placed near a fire to dry more quickly. Perhaps they were warmed by accident. Perhaps someone noticed that heated seeds changed in color and scent. However it began, roasting became one of the great transformations in coffee's long history. Roasting means heating the seeds until they brown and become aromatic. The heat changes the seed from something hard and greenish into something fragrant, darker, and more brittle. It draws out the aromas now so closely connected with coffee. Warm, toasty, nutty, sometimes sweet, sometimes earthy. This change would not have needed to happen all at once. It may have taken many attempts. Some seeds might have been lightly warmed, others darkened more deeply. Some may have been pounded with stones or crushed after heating. Slowly, people would have learned that roasted seeds could be broken into smaller pieces. They would have learned that water could draw flavor from them. A bowl, a pot, or a simple vessel near a small fire could become part of the process. There is something peaceful in imagining these early experiments. Seeds drying in the sun, a small flame sheltered from the wind, warm stones, hands turning, sorting, crushing. A faint scent rising where before there had only been fruit and leaf. No one needed to know that a global beverage was beginning to take shape. It was enough to notice that heat changed the seed, that water carried its flavor, and that the result could be shared. The move from eating coffee to drinking coffee was likely gradual. It may have happened in more than one place, in more than one way. People often discover useful preparations through ordinary repetition. A little more heat, a finer grind, a longer steep, a different vessel, a shared taste among neighbors. What later generations recognize as a tradition may begin as a series of small, patient choices. In time, roasted coffee and hot water came together in a form closer to the drink we know today. It would not yet have been the filtered coffee of later centuries, nor the espresso of modern cafés. It may have been thick and simple, with grounds settling at the bottom of a cup or bowl, yet the basic idea was present, the seed of the coffee cherry, transformed by drying, roasting, grinding, and water. Around such a drink, people could gather. Coffee's earliest social life may have been modest: a household, a small group of travelers, a few people pausing in the cool of morning or evening. A shared bowl or cup creates a circle, however small. Someone prepares, someone receives, someone notices the taste, the warmth, the feeling of alertness. In this way, a plant becomes more than a plant. It becomes part of hospitality, memory, and daily rhythm. Still, much of this early story remains softly uncertain. The written record grows clearer later, across the Red Sea in Yemen. There, by the 15th century, coffee appears more firmly in history as a drink used in communities of devotion and learning. But before those records, before the ports and coffeehouses and wide trade routes, there was this slower beginning: a forest fruit, a seed dried in the sun, a leaf steeped in water, a scent released by fire. And as coffee's path began to move beyond the highlands, it carried these quiet discoveries with it. From branch to hand, from seed to vessel, from local knowledge to wider custom, coffee was becoming something people could share. Farther along the route, beyond the green slopes and shaded groves, water waited in the distance. Across it lay Yemen, with terraced hillsides, stone villages, and the first clearer traces of coffee as a beloved drink. Chapter 3: Across the Red Sea to Yemen. The Red Sea lies like a long, narrow ribbon between northeastern Africa and the Arabian Peninsula. In the soft light of morning, its surface can appear almost still, holding the colors of sky and shore. Along its coasts, people have crossed for many centuries, carrying food, cloth, incense, stories, and seeds. The water was not only a boundary, it was also a route, a quiet passage between landscapes. Somewhere along these crossings, coffee made its way from the highlands of northeastern Africa toward Yemen. The exact path is not fully known. It may have traveled with merchants, pilgrims, farmers, or religious communities. It may have moved in more than one way, over more than one generation. History often preserves the arrival of a plant only after people have already begun to know it well. What we can say with more confidence is that Yemen became central to the earliest documented history of coffee as a drink. The coffee plant had deep botanical roots in Ethiopia and nearby regions, but the first strong written evidence for coffee drinking appears in Yemen in the 15th century. By then, coffee was no longer only a forest fruit or a local curiosity. It had become part of human practice, prepared and shared for a purpose. To imagine Yemen's coffee country, we leave the coast and travel slowly inland. The land rises into mountains, dry and beautiful, with stone villages set among steep slopes. In many places, farmers shape the hillsides into terraces. Terrace farming means growing crops on flat steps, cut or built into a hill. These steps help hold soil and water where the ground might otherwise be too steep. From a distance, the terraces can look like gentle lines drawn across the mountains, following the curves of the land. On these stepped hillsides, coffee found a new home. The plant could grow in the cooler air of higher elevations, where clouds sometimes gathered, and the sun moved across the slopes with measured warmth. Coffee trees are not tall like forest giants. They are smaller, with glossy green leaves and fruit that ripens into red cherries. Inside each cherry are the seeds that people came to call beans. Yemen's farmers learned how to tend these plants in difficult but carefully managed landscapes. Water was precious, soil was protected. Shade, altitude, and season all mattered. Over time, coffee cultivation became part of the mountain economy, linked to villages, markets, and eventually ports along the Red Sea. In the 15th century, coffee was especially associated with Sufi communities in Yemen. A Sufi is a practitioner of a devotional tradition within Islam, often emphasizing prayer, remembrance, discipline, and closeness to God. Sufi gatherings could include recitation, reflection, and worship during the quiet hours of night. In such settings, coffee was valued for its ability to support wakefulness. The natural compound in coffee that helps people feel more alert is caffeine. But in the historical setting of Yemen, coffee was not first described in modern scientific language. It was known through experience. A warm, dark drink could help worshippers remain attentive during long devotional gatherings. It could be prepared, poured, and shared in small cups as the night deepened and the air cooled. It is important to speak gently and carefully here. We do not need to say that Sufis invented coffee. The beginning was likely more gradual and more complex than a single invention. But Sufi communities are among the earliest documented users of coffee as a drink, and their role was important in helping coffee become known and valued. The Arabic word kahwa became closely connected with coffee. Kahwa is an older word with a history of its own, and over time it came to refer to this new drink. From that word, through many languages and many journeys, came later names: coffee in English, café in French, café in German, and other related words around the world. The sound changed from place to place, but the thread remained. A word can travel almost like a seed. It crosses borders, settles into new speech, and takes on local color. In Yemen, kahwa belonged to the world of small cups, roasted seeds, shared attention, and careful preparation. In later centuries, the word would find its way into markets, coffeehouses, ships' ledgers, household kitchens, and café signs far from the Red Sea. For now, though, the story remains among Yemen's mountains and towns. The drink moved through circles of use: religious communities, households, traders, and urban gatherings. It was not instantly common everywhere. New habits rarely spread all at once. They move person by person, cup by cup. Someone tastes. Someone carries a small amount to another town. Someone learns how to roast the seeds a little darker, grind them more finely, or pour the drink with greater care. The preparation of coffee in Yemen was part of this slow unfolding. The beans had to be gathered from the fruit, dried, roasted, crushed, or ground, and combined with water. Each step changed the plant into something more familiar to us. Roasting was especially important because heat drew out the fragrance and darker flavor that people came to recognize as coffee. The aroma rising from roasted beans could travel through a room before the cup was even lifted. As coffee became more established, it connected mountain and coast. In the highlands, plants were tended on terraces. In villages and towns, beans were prepared and consumed. Farther down the roads, merchants carried goods toward the Red Sea. The same sea that had once helped bring coffee to Yemen would soon help carry Yemeni coffee outward. One can picture the journey at an unhurried pace. Coffee cherries ripening among green leaves, hands gathering them in season, beans drying in the sun, sacks moving down from mountain paths toward markets. The road descends from stone terraces to warmer air, from quiet hillsides to busier towns, and then toward the coast. There, along the edge of the Red Sea, ships waited for cargo. Among the ports of Yemen, one name would become especially known in the history of coffee. It was a coastal city where merchants weighed beans, sailors prepared for voyages, and the aroma of coffee began to mingle with salt air and desert wind. That port was Mocha, and in time, its name would travel almost as widely as the drink itself. Chapter 4: The Port of Mocha. On the western edge of Yemen, where the land meets the Red Sea, there was once a port whose name traveled farther than its walls, farther than its harbor, and farther than many of the ships that rested along its shore. Mocha was not the first place where coffee grew, and it was not the only place from which coffee moved. But for several centuries, especially from the 16th to the 18th centuries, Mocha became one of the names most closely tied to coffee in the wider world. A port is a coastal place where ships load and unload goods. In Mocha, the shore opened toward the Red Sea, that long, narrow body of water between Africa and Arabia. Across its surface moved sailors, merchants, pilgrims, letters, spices, cloth, and in time, sacks of coffee. The harbor water shifted quietly against wooden hulls. Ropes creaked in the warm air. People carried goods from ship to storehouse, from storehouse to market, and from market back toward the sea. Coffee had already found a place in Yemen's mountain regions. On terraced hillsides where flat steps were cut into slopes for farming, coffee trees grew in the dry highland air. Their cherries ripened slowly, and inside each fruit were the seeds that would become coffee beans. From those mountain farms, the coffee was gathered, dried, prepared, and carried down toward the coast. The journey from the highlands to the port was part of coffee's early story. Before coffee could cross seas, it crossed hills and valleys. It moved by animal, by hand, by cart, and by careful trade. In the shade of storerooms, the beans might be packed into rough sacks, In the market they could be weighed and inspected. A merchant might lift a handful, feel the shape of the beans, notice their dryness, and consider where they would go next. When goods are sent from one place to be sold in another, they are called exports. Coffee became one of Yemen's important exports. It was a commodity, meaning a product traded in large quantities. Yet even as it became a commodity, it remained something intimate. Each sack held countless future cups. Each bean had passed through soil, branch, fruit, sun, and human hands. From Mocha, coffee traveled to markets around the Red Sea and beyond. It moved north towards cities connected to the Ottoman Empire, the large empire centered in present-day Turkey that ruled many regions for centuries. It reached places where coffee was already becoming part of daily and social life. Later it moved farther still, into Mediterranean trade routes, and eventually into Europe. The rhythm of this trade was slow by modern standards. A ship might wait for cargo, weather, permission, or the turning of the season. Merchants kept accounts with ink and patience. Sailors watched the wind. In the mornings the harbor could be bright and dry, with the scent of salt, dust, rope, and coffee mingling in the air. Sacks might be stacked in patches of shade, protected from too much sun and dampness. The work was ordinary and careful, repeated day after day. Because so much coffee passed through Mocha, the city's name became attached to the coffee itself. In many places Mocha came to mean coffee associated with Yemen and with this famous Red Sea port. This is important to remember because today the word often brings to mind a drink flavored with chocolate. That modern meaning came later. At first, Mocha was not a name for chocolate. It was a place, and then a name connected with Yemeni coffee. Over time, the meaning softened and changed. Later European tastes and café traditions helped link the word mocha with the pairing of coffee and chocolate. But the older meaning remains like a quiet echo. Before mocha was a sweet café drink, mocha was a harbor, with ships, merchants, storehouses, and beans bound for distant cups. The value of coffee made it something people tried to protect and control. Yemeni authorities and merchants sometimes attempted to manage the coffee trade carefully. There are accounts suggesting that they limited the export of living plants or viable seeds, and that beans sent abroad were often processed in ways that made them less likely to grow. A viable seed is one that can still sprout into a plant. A processed or infertile bean cannot easily become a new coffee tree. These efforts were not perfect, and the details varied over time. Trade is rarely controlled completely, especially when many people, ports, and routes are involved. Still, such measures show how valuable coffee had become. Yemen's coffee was not only a local drink, it was a product desired in many places, and those who managed it understood that the plant itself was part of its wealth. In Mocha, the business of coffee belonged to a wider world of exchange. Ships did not carry only beans, they carried news, habits, languages, and tastes. A merchant who bought coffee might also learn how it was prepared. A traveler might carry memories of small cups served in Yemen or in cities farther north. A sailor might know the smell of the beans before knowing the flavor of the drink. Slowly, coffee's reputation moved outward, not in one sudden wave, but in many crossings. There is something gentle in imagining those early shipments, not because trade was simple, and not because history was without difficulty, but because the movement itself was steady. Coffee passed from hillside farms to coastal markets, from storerooms into shipholds, from Red Sea waters into wider networks. Each journey added another thread to the long fabric of coffee's history. By the time European merchants began to know coffee more directly, Mocha was already a name of importance. Its coffee had reached into the Ottoman world and beyond. In ports and markets, people who had never seen Yemen's mountains could still speak of Mocha. The place became part of the drink's identity, a reminder that coffee was shaped not only by plants and preparation, but by geography, trade, and memory. As the ships left the harbor, their sails catching the wind above the Red Sea, they carried coffee towards cities where it would become more than an export. It would become a reason to gather, to speak, to listen, and to pass time together. From Mocha's quiet storehouses and sunlit docks, the journey continued outward, toward coffeehouses, homes, and public rooms where the dark drink would find new meanings in new hands. Chapter 5. Coffee in the Islamic World. In the quiet of an old city evening, lanterns begin to blow along narrow streets. Their light rests softly on stone walls, wooden doors, and the edges of woven awnings. From an open doorway comes the low murmur of voices, the gentle clink of small cups, and the warm scent of coffee being poured. Inside, people sit close enough for conversation, but not in haste. Some listen to a poem, some talk of trade, travel, and family matters. Others bend over a board game, moving pieces with calm attention. A tray passes from hand to hand, holding cups of dark coffee, each one small, warm, and carefully offered. This kind of place came to be known as a coffee house. A coffee house is a public place where people drink coffee and socialize. It may be simple or refined, busy or quiet, but at its heart, it is a place of gathering. And as coffee moved beyond Yemen, coffee houses became one of the most important settings in its history. From the mountains and towns of Yemen, coffee traveled along routes already shaped by pilgrims, merchants, scholars, and sailors. It moved northward and outward, carried in sacks, shared in cups, and spoken of in many languages. By the 16th century, coffee was known in major cities of the Islamic world, including Mecca, Cairo, Damascus, and Istanbul. In Mecca, where pilgrims arrived from many regions, coffee found a natural crossroads. People came to the city for religious devotion, but they also carried stories, habits, and goods with them. A drink tasted in one place could be remembered and taken elsewhere. A custom observed during a visit could return home with a traveler. In this way, coffee's path was not only a matter of trade, it was also a matter of human movement, memory, and hospitality. In Cairo, one of the great cities of learning and commerce, coffee entered a rich urban world. The city's streets were full of markets, schools, mosques, workshops, and homes. Coffee could be served in private gatherings, but it also belonged to public life. In coffee houses, people exchanged news, listened to recitations, enjoyed music, and watched games played with steady concentration. A cup of coffee offered a reason to sit for a while and hear what others had to say. Farther north in Damascus, coffee joined the rhythms of another old and graceful city. Damascus had long been a place of gardens, trade, scholarship, and craft. Coffee houses there, as in other cities, could become neighborhood meeting places. A person might step inside to rest from the day's work, to meet a friend, to hear a story, or to learn what had happened in another quarter of the city. Coffee helped gather small circles of attention around a table, a tray, or a familiar voice. Then, in Istanbul, coffee entered the life of the Ottoman Empire. The Ottoman Empire was a large empire centered in present-day Turkey, and for centuries it ruled many regions across southeastern Europe, Western Asia, and northern Africa. Istanbul, its capital, was a city of palaces, markets, waterways, mosques, and crowded streets. According to common historical accounts, coffee houses appeared there in the 16th century and soon became part of the city's social fabric. In these rooms, coffee was more than a drink. It was part of an atmosphere. There might be cushions and carpets, wooden benches, lamps, trays, and cups arranged with care. There might be poetry, music, storytelling, or the reading of news. There might be backgammon or chess, quiet laughter, thoughtful pauses, and long discussions that moved from everyday concerns to matters of religion, politics, literature, and trade. Coffee houses could serve many purposes at once. They were places of leisure, where people spent time without the formality of a court or the privacy of a home. They were places of information, where news could travel by word of mouth. They were places of business where merchants and craftspeople might meet. They were also places of companionship, where a person could become known by face, habit, and favorite seat. Because coffee was new in many places, and because coffee houses gathered people in public, some authorities looked at them with caution. Religious scholars and political leaders sometimes debated coffee. A debate is a discussion or disagreement about whether something should be accepted. Some wondered whether coffee's stimulating quality made it improper. Others were concerned less about the drink itself, and more about the conversations that took place around it. In Mecca, in the early 16th century, there were debates and restrictions connected with coffee. In some places and moments, coffee houses were closed or coffee was discouraged. But these restrictions were not the same everywhere, and they did not last permanently across the Islamic world. Attitudes differed from city to city, from ruler to ruler, and from scholar to scholar. Over time, coffee became widely accepted in many Muslim societies. It was served in homes, markets, religious settings, and public gathering places. People found ways to include it within their customs of welcome and sociability. The early questions did not disappear all at once, but coffee's place in ordinary life became stronger. Its usefulness, its flavor, and its role in hospitality helped it endure. The spread of coffee through the Islamic world was therefore not a single sudden event. It was a gradual settling into daily patterns. In one city, coffee might be linked to devotion and wakefulness, in another to trade and conversation, in another to music, poetry, and news. Everywhere it went, it adapted to local manners and local tastes. One can imagine a traveler moving from Yemen to Mecca, from Cairo to Damascus, from Damascus to Istanbul, noticing both difference and familiarity. The cups may vary, the language may change, the room may be plain or ornamented, but again and again there is the same simple gesture. Coffee poured, coffee offered, coffee received. As evening deepens, the coffeehouse grows quieter. A storyteller's voice lowers. The game ends. Someone folds a piece of paper and tucks it away. The last cups rest on a tray, their ground settling slowly at the bottom. And from these public rooms of conversation, the story of coffee now turns gently toward the home, toward the small pot, the careful grind, the rising foam, and the art of preparing coffee in Ottoman life. Chapter 6: Ottoman Coffee and the Art of Preparation. In an Ottoman courtyard, where afternoon light rests gently on stone and tile, coffee becomes more than a drink. It becomes a small ceremony of welcome. A tray is set down with care. A few cups wait nearby, no larger than a closed hand. Somewhere in the house, beans are being warmed, ground, and measured. The work is quiet, but it carries meaning. By the 16th century, coffee had entered many cities of the Ottoman Empire, a large empire centered in present-day Turkey, with lands reaching across southeastern Europe, Western Asia, and North Africa. In Istanbul, Cairo, Damascus, and other cities, coffee was served in public coffeehouses, but it also found a lasting place inside homes. There it joined the rhythms of visits, conversation, family gatherings, and hospitality. Hospitality is one of coffee's oldest companions. To offer coffee was to offer attention. It said, in a modest and graceful way, "You are welcome here." The cup might be small, but the gesture was generous. The preparation began with the beans. In earlier centuries, coffee was often roasted close to the time it was made. Green coffee beans, pale and firm before roasting, were placed in a pan or small roasting vessel over heat. Someone watched them carefully as they changed. Slowly the beans darkened. Their scent deepened. A soft toasted aroma rose into the room, warm and slightly sweet, with hints of earth and smoke. Roasting is the heating of coffee seeds until they brown and develop the aromas we associate with coffee. It is a transformation, simple to observe, yet full of skill. The beans could not be left unattended. Too little heat and the flavors remained hidden. Too much and the coffee became harsh. So the roaster listened, watched, and judged by color, scent, and experience. In this way, coffee preparation was a craft of the senses. It belonged not only to merchants and coffeehouse keepers, but to households, hosts, and family members who learned by doing. After roasting came grinding. For Ottoman-style coffee, the beans were ground very finely, much finer than for many later brewing methods. A hand mill might be used, turned slowly and steadily. The roasted beans passed between metal parts and emerged as a soft powder, dark and fragrant. The motion was patient. The sound of the mill was low and regular, a small domestic music. This fine grind was important because Ottoman coffee was not filtered in the way many people now know. It was brewed with the grounds still in the water. Unfiltered coffee means that the coffee grounds remain present in the cup, rather than being strained out through cloth, paper, or metal. Because the grounds stayed with the liquid, they needed to be very fine, so they could settle gently at the bottom after serving. The pot used for this style of coffee is often called a sezvi, or an ibrick, is a small, long-handled pot used to prepare finely ground coffee. It is often made of metal and shaped with a wider base, a narrower neck, and a handle long enough to keep the hand away from the heat. Into this pot went water, finely ground coffee, and sometimes sugar, depending on taste and custom. In some households, sugar was added during preparation rather than afterward. In others, coffee might be served plain. Customs varied by region, family, and occasion. Ottoman coffee culture was rich, but it was not identical everywhere. What one household did in Istanbul might differ from a home in Damascus, Sarajevo, Cairo, or Aleppo. Over time, related traditions developed across many communities, and names such as Turkish coffee, Ottoman coffee, Greek coffee, Arabic coffee, and Armenian coffee came to overlap in methods and memory. Each name carries its own history and belonging. There was no need to hurry. The coffee warmed slowly. Tiny bubbles began to gather. A delicate foam rose toward the narrow neck of the pot. A practiced hand knew when to lift the sesve away from the heat, allowing the foam to settle, and when to return it. In some traditions, this rising foam was treasured. It showed care and preparation, and gave the cup a soft surface when poured. The pouring, too, required attention. The coffee was divided into small cups, often without handles, set on saucers or arranged on a tray. If there was foam, the host might try to share it evenly among the cups. The grounds came along with the coffee, dark and fine, but they were not meant to be swallowed. After pouring, the cup rested for a moment. The grounds settled to the bottom, leaving the upper part smooth enough to sip. A guest might lift the cup slowly. The first taste was strong, warm, and concentrated. Ottoman-style coffee is usually served in small amounts, because its flavor is full and its texture close. It invites slow drinking. Between sips, conversation can open at an unhurried pace. In Ottoman social life, coffee became linked with etiquette. Etiquette means customary polite behavior, the small shared rules that help people show respect. Who was served first, how the tray was carried, how the cup was offered, and how a guest received it could all matter. These customs were not always formal in the same way, and they changed from place to place. But coffee often helped shape the courtesy of a visit. In a household, the arrival of guests might bring out a coffee tray. The order and meaning of gestures varied, yet the spirit was steady. Preparation, offering, receiving, and sharing. Coffee also found a place in more formal moments of life. In some Ottoman and post-Ottoman communities, coffee played a role in marriage customs. When families visited to discuss a possible marriage, coffee might be prepared and served as part of the meeting. Stories are often told about the care with which coffee was made for guests, though the exact customs differed widely by region and family. Such moments show how deeply coffee had entered the language of social life. It was not only consumed, it was observed, interpreted, and remembered. There were also quieter customs connected to the grounds left in the cup. In some communities, people turned the empty cup over and looked at the patterns formed by the settled grounds, treating them as symbols for playful or reflective fortune-telling. This practice became well known in certain places, but it was not universal, and it should not be imagined as part of every coffee gathering. For many people, the grounds were simply the natural end of an unfiltered cup. In coffeehouses, the same basic drink belonged to a different setting. People gathered in rooms with cushions, low stools, or wooden benches arranged for conversation. Cups moved from hand to hand. News was exchanged. Poetry might be recited. Games might be played. A coffeehouse keeper needed skill not only in brewing, but in maintaining a place where people wished to linger. At home, the atmosphere could be more intimate. A parent might prepare coffee for visiting relatives. A neighbor might stop by and be offered a cup. A host might remember exactly how a friend preferred it, sweet, lightly sweetened, or without sugar. These preferences became part of knowing one another. Coffee held small details of relationship. Over time, Ottoman coffee culture influenced many neighboring regions, and those regions shaped the tradition in return. The empire itself included many languages, religions, and peoples. This is why similar methods can be found under different names today. The shared pot and small cup traveled through many kitchens and marketplaces, gathering local meanings as they went. Still, the essence of the method remained beautifully simple. Roast, grind, simmer, pour, wait, and sip. There is a calm wisdom in this sequence. Nothing is hidden from view. The beans are seen, the powder is measured, the pot is watched, the foam rises, the cup is filled. The drink asks for attention, but not haste. It rewards patience with warmth and aroma. As evening settles over an Ottoman street, the scent of coffee drifts from houses and coffeehouses alike. It passes through open windows, over courtyards and into narrow lanes where merchants, travelers, sailors, and diplomats come and go. Some will carry the memory of that scent with them. Some will describe the dark drink in letters or conversations. Some will help bring coffee onward, toward Mediterranean ports and European curiosity. And so, from the small long-handled pot and the tiny cup, the story of coffee continues its quiet journey westward. Chapter 7. Coffee arrives in Europe. In the soft morning haze of Venice, the water seemed to hold the color of pearl. Small boats moved along the canals with patient strokes, and beyond the narrow bridges and stone quays, larger ships rested at the edge of the lagoon. Their holds carried the familiar treasures of Mediterranean trade: spices, silk, dyes, glass, grain, and other goods that had crossed sea routes linking Europe with North Africa, the Levant, and the wider Ottoman world. Mediterranean trade simply means the exchange of goods across the Mediterranean Sea and its surrounding ports. For centuries, this sea had been less a barrier than a broad, shifting road. Merchants, sailors, interpreters, diplomats, and travelers carried not only objects, but also words, habits, tastes, and stories. Among the many things that moved through these routes was coffee, a dark drink already known and used in parts of the Islamic world long before many Europeans tasted it. Coffee did not arrive in Europe all at once. There was no single doorway, no single cup that changed everything in a moment. It came gradually through contact and curiosity. A merchant might see it served in an Ottoman city. A traveler might describe it after visiting Cairo, Damascus, or Istanbul. A diplomat might encounter it during meetings and ceremonies. A physician or scholar might hear of its effects and wonder whether it belonged among useful plants and medicines. Venice was one of the early European gateways for coffee because of its long trading connections. Venetian merchants had deep ties across the eastern Mediterranean, and their city was accustomed to receiving unfamiliar goods. In its markets and warehouses, products from many lands rested side by side: pepper from far coasts, sugar from warm islands, woven cloth, resins, perfumes, and dried plants whose names carried the sound of distant languages. Among these goods, coffee beans may have seemed modest. They were small, hard seeds, dark after roasting, with an aroma that revealed itself most fully only when heated and brewed. To someone who had never seen the coffee cherry, the fruit of the coffee plant, these beans might not have looked like the center of a future habit. They were simply another curious item in the hands of merchants and healers. By the late 16th century, coffee was known in parts of Europe, though it remained uncommon. In the 17th century, it became more available, especially in cities connected to trade. At first, many Europeans understood coffee through the language of medicine. This was a common way of meeting new foods and drinks. Tea, chocolate, spices, and many herbs were often discussed in terms of their possible effects on the body. In some places, coffee was sold by apothecaries. An apothecary was an early kind of pharmacist, a person who prepared and sold medicines, herbs, syrups, and other remedies. Their shops were often fragrant places, lined with jars, drawers, bundles of dried leaves, and small packets of rare substances. Coffee could sit there among roots, seeds, and spices, described according to the medical ideas of the time. There was a quiet uncertainty in these first European responses. Coffee was unusual, and unusual things were often met with both interest and caution. Some praised its clarity and lightness compared with alcoholic drinks. Others found its bitterness strange. Some writers described it with fascination, noting its dark color and the custom of drinking it hot without rushing. Travelers returned with accounts of people sitting together over small cups, speaking, listening, and passing time. The language used for coffee shifted as it moved. The Arabic word kahwa had already traveled through Turkish and other languages, and European words such as coffee, cafe, and cafe grew from this family of sounds. Each language shaped the word slightly differently, as if fitting it gently into its own household. There is a well-known story that Pope Clement VIII, when asked to condemn coffee, tasted it and approved of it. The tale is charming and often repeated, but historians treat it with caution. It is difficult to confirm, and it should be understood more as a colorful tradition than a secure fact. What is clearer is that coffee entered Europe through many ordinary paths: commerce, observation, conversation, and the slow widening of taste. In Venice, a packet of coffee might pass from a merchant's store to a noble household, or from an apothecary's shelf to a curious scholar. In other port cities, similar exchanges unfolded. Ships brought beans, letters mentioned the drink, travelers described how it was prepared. Little by little, coffee became less of a marvel and more of a possibility. It first spread among certain circles: merchants who already dealt in imported goods, physicians interested in new substances, scholars who read travel accounts, and urban elites with the means to try unfamiliar luxuries. A cup of coffee in these early years was not yet an everyday morning companion for most Europeans. It was more likely to be a subject of discussion, a fashionable curiosity, or a drink shared by people who enjoyed the wider world of trade and learning. The preparation itself also invited attention. Coffee had to be roasted, ground, and brewed. Roasting meant heating the seeds until they browned and released their scent. Grinding broke them into small particles. Brewing brought them together with hot water to make the dark drink. These steps were simple in principle, but each required care, and the methods varied according to who had learned them and where. Over time, the aroma of coffee began to drift beyond private rooms and shops. It moved from the world of rare goods toward the world of public life. In cities where people gathered to read, trade, debate, and do business, coffee found a natural place. It offered warmth, alertness, and a reason to remain seated among others. By the middle of the 17th century, coffee was no longer only a traveler's report or an apothecary's curiosity. It was beginning to appear in public rooms, where cups were set down on wooden tables, newspapers and pamphlets were unfolded, and voices lowered into steady conversation. From the quiet docks of Venice and the shelves of merchants and apothecaries, coffee continued its slow European journey. It had crossed seas and languages, passed through careful hands, and entered new habits without leaving behind its older ones. Ahead lay the coffeehouse, a room of polished tables, printed pages, business talk, and murmured ideas, where this once unfamiliar drink would become part of the daily rhythm of many European cities. Chapter 8: The European Coffeehouse. On a cool morning in a European city, sometime in the 17th century, a narrow street might have held the soft sounds of wheels over stone, a door opening on iron hinges, and rain tapping lightly against small panes of glass. Inside there might be a room warmed by candles and conversation. Wooden tables, polished by many sleeves and elbows, stood close together. A few newspapers lay open beside cups. Somewhere, ink dried slowly on a sheet of paper. A server moved quietly between the tables, carrying small dishes, fresh coffee, and the news of the day. By the 17th and 18th centuries, coffee houses had begun to spread through many European cities. They did not appear all at once, and they were not the same everywhere. Each city shaped them in its own way. Some were small and practical, serving merchants and travelers. Others became places where writers, scholars, printers, brokers, and curious readers gathered. But in many of them, coffee offered something different from ale, wine, or beer. It was warm, dark, and stimulating in a gentle way. It could accompany reading, business, conversation, and thought. In England, one of the earliest coffee houses is often associated with Oxford around 1650. Oxford was a city of colleges, books, and debate, and coffee found a place among people who liked to gather and talk. A little later, in 1652, London saw the opening of its first notable coffee house. London was growing into a busy center of trade, printing, politics, and shipping. Its streets carried people from docks, markets, courts, churches, and workshops. Into that lively but often misty world came the coffee house, a room where a person might sit with a cup and hear what others had heard. English coffee houses came to be nicknamed penny universities. The phrase was affectionate and a little exaggerated, but it tells us something important. A penny university meant a place where, for the price of a cup of coffee, a person could hear news, listen to arguments, learn about recent books, or exchange ideas. It was not a university in the formal sense. There were no degrees, gowns, or official lessons, but there was talk, and talk could carry knowledge from one table to another. Still, It is helpful to imagine these places with care. They were not open equally to everyone. Access often depended on gender, class, money, reputation, and local custom. Many European coffeehouses were largely male public spaces. Women certainly took part in coffee culture in homes, courts, and some public settings, but the famous coffeehouse world of London, Paris, and other cities often reflected the social limits of its time. A person's clothing, accent, occupation, or status could affect whether they felt welcome. So, the coffeehouse was a place of exchange, but not a perfectly equal one. On a table in an English coffeehouse, one might find newspapers and pamphlets. A pamphlet was a short printed text about current topics, often sold cheaply and passed from hand to hand. Pamphlets could discuss politics, religion, trade, science, or public events. Printing was becoming a more powerful part of urban life, and coffeehouses helped printed words travel. Someone might read a notice aloud, another person might disagree quietly, a third might write a letter in response. In this way, the room became a meeting place for spoken and printed news. Coffeehouses also became useful to business. In London, some houses were known for particular interests or professions. One might attract merchants concerned with trade across the Atlantic. Another might draw people interested in books. Another might become a meeting place for scientists or physicians. Still another might be filled with talk of ships, cargoes, storms, and ports. From this world came one of the best-known examples, Lloyd's of London. It grew from a coffeehouse associated with shipping news and marine insurance. Merchants, ship owners, and underwriters gathered there to learn which vessels had arrived, which were delayed, and what risks might lie ahead on distant seas. Over time, this gathering of information and agreements helped develop into the institution known as Lloyd's of London. Insurance, in simple terms, is protection against financial loss. If a ship carried valuable goods across dangerous waters, the owner might pay others to share the risk. If the voyage went well, the insurers kept the payment. If the ship was lost, they helped cover the loss. Such arrangements needed trust, information, and regular contact. A coffeehouse, with its steady flow of news and familiar faces, was well suited to that kind of work. In another coffeehouse, the atmosphere might have been literary rather than commercial. Writers listened for stories, printers looked for subscribers, readers discussed essays and poems. The coffeehouse did not create literature by itself, just as it did not create science or politics by itself. But it supported a wider culture of exchange. It gave people a place to meet, to compare what they had read, and to carry ideas outward into letters, books, newspapers, and private homes. Across the Channel, Parisian cafés became important social and literary spaces. The word café itself came from coffee, and in Paris the café became a familiar part of urban life. A Parisian café might hold writers, philosophers, actors, students, officials, or travelers. The tables might be small, the mirrors bright, the cups carefully placed. Conversation could move from theater to government, from poetry to fashion, from scientific curiosity to everyday gossip. Parisian cafés became known not only for coffee, but for the art of lingering, sitting long enough for thought and talk to unfold. In Vienna, coffeehouse culture also developed a lasting identity. The Viennese coffeehouse became famous for its calm interiors, newspapers, marble-top tables, and the sense that a guest might remain for a long while over a single cup. There is a popular story that connects Viennese coffee culture directly to the Ottoman siege of 1683, and to a man named Franz Georg Kolschitsky, who is said to have helped introduce coffee after sacks of beans were left behind. The story is often told and has become part of coffee legend. Yet historians treat parts of it with caution. Like many origin stories, it may contain memory, pride, and embellishment woven together. What can be said more gently is that Vienna, through its position in Central Europe and its contact with Ottoman and other trade networks, developed a coffeehouse tradition that became deeply influential over time. Each city gave the coffeehouse a different tone. In London, one could imagine talk of ships, stocks, sermons, and pamphlets. In Paris, perhaps literature, theater, and public opinion moved through the rooms. In Vienna, newspapers and long reflection became part of the rhythm. In Venice, earlier contact with Mediterranean trade had already helped introduce coffee to European tastes. In ports and capitals alike, coffeehouses became small interiors connected to a much larger world. The cup on the table was never only local. Its beans had crossed seas and borders. The drink that accompanied a newspaper in London or a poem in Paris still carried traces of the Red Sea, Yemen's terraces, Ottoman preparation, and older highland forests far away. The coffeehouse made those distances feel ordinary. A merchant can sip coffee while discussing a ship from the Levant. A scholar could drink it while reading about a discovery made in another country. A printer could serve it beside the latest sheet of news. The world seemed to arrive quietly, cup by cup. And yet, beneath the polished tables and candlelit windows, another story was beginning to grow. European taste for coffee was increasing. More people wanted the drink. More merchants wanted to sell it. More governments and trading companies wanted reliable supplies. The warm rooms of conversation depended on beans that had to be grown, harvested, dried, packed, shipped, and sold. So as the coffee house became part of European daily life, the history of coffee widened again. It moved beyond the doorway, beyond the newspapers and cups, toward islands, colonies, plantations, and distant farms. The next part of the journey would be quieter in some ways, but heavier in others, for the growing demand for coffee became tied to empire, land, and labor across the wider world. Chapter 9: Coffee, Empires, and Plantations. By the time coffee had become familiar in the coffeehouses of Europe, its journey had already crossed mountains, seas, and languages. It had passed from highland forests to Yemeni terraces, from Ottoman homes to Mediterranean ports, and from small cups in public rooms to the desks of merchants and readers. With each crossing, more people came to know its aroma and its steady place in daily conversation. Over time, demand grew. In Europe, coffee was still a product from far away. For many years, Yemen remained central to the trade, and the port of Mocha was closely tied to the beans that reached foreign markets. But European trading companies and colonial powers wanted a supply they could control more directly. Coffee was becoming valuable, and value often drew the attention of empire. To understand this part of coffee's history, it helps to pause over a few words. A plantation is a large farm, often devoted to one crop grown for export. Sugar, tobacco, cotton, tea, and coffee were all grown this way in different parts of the world. Colonialism means the control of one region or people by another power, often for resources, land, labor, and profit. In the history of coffee, colonialism shaped where coffee was planted, who owned the land, who profited, and who was forced to do the work. This is a quieter chapter in the story, but an important one. The global spread of coffee cannot be separated from the labor of enslaved and oppressed people. In the late 17th and early 18th centuries, the Dutch established coffee cultivation in Java, an island in present-day Indonesia. Java was then under Dutch colonial influence, and coffee plants were brought there as part of a wider effort to grow profitable crops in controlled territories. The climate and landscape in parts of Java were well suited to coffee. Warm air, tropical rain, volcanic soils, and upland regions helped the plants take root. Rows of coffee trees began to appear on humid hillsides. Their glossy leaves caught the rain. Their white blossoms opened briefly with a delicate fragrance. Red cherries ripened on the branches, and after harvest, beans were dried, sorted, and prepared for shipment. From harbors, coffee traveled onward in the holds of ships, crossing long routes toward European markets. Java became so closely associated with coffee that in time the word Java became a common nickname for coffee itself. Even today, the word still carries a faint echo of those old trade routes. Yet behind the simple nickname was a complicated history of colonial rule, forced cultivation, and unequal power. Coffee plants did not move around the world by chance alone. They were carried deliberately, sometimes carefully guarded, sometimes exchanged through botanical gardens, trading companies, and imperial networks. European powers studied where coffee might grow and sought to transplant it into lands they controlled. Coffee was not just a drink. It had become a commodity, a product traded in large quantities, shaped by markets and by empire. From the Indian Ocean world, coffee spread farther into colonial territories. It was planted on islands and in coastal regions, in places where the climate seemed promising and where colonial authorities hoped to create dependable exports. Coffee moved into parts of the Caribbean and the Americas where it joined other plantation crops already tied to harsh labor systems. In the 18th century, French colonial coffee cultivation expanded from places such as Martinique, an island in the Caribbean. From there, coffee plants and coffee knowledge moved through other French-controlled territories and beyond. The Caribbean, with its warm weather and mountainous interiors, became one of the important regions in the widening coffee world. But the beauty of a landscape does not tell the whole truth of what happened there. There may have been rain on broad green leaves, drying patios warmed by the sun, and ships moving slowly through blue harbors. There were also systems built on exploitation. Much colonial coffee production depended on enslaved labor forced from people who were legally treated as property. It also depended in some places on forced labor and coerced labor. Coerced labor means work compelled by force, pressure, law, debt, or threat, even when it may not be called slavery. These words are plain, and they need to remain plain. Coffee's expansion brought wealth to merchants, plantation owners, and empires, but the people who planted, harvested, carried, dried, and processed the crop often received little freedom, safety, or reward. Many were bound by systems they did not choose. Their labor made possible much of the coffee that entered European cups. The story of coffee, then, is not only a story of taste, trade, and sociable rooms. It is also a story of land taken into imperial systems, of people compelled to work, and of profits moving unevenly across oceans. To tell the history gently does not mean leaving this out. It means holding the truth with care. Different colonies had different labor systems, and these systems changed over time. In some places, plantations were large and strictly controlled. In others, small farms and mixed forms of production also appeared. Not all coffee was grown in the same way, and not every region followed the same path. Still, exploitation was widespread enough that it became deeply woven into coffee's global expansion. Coffee plants themselves were quiet travelers. They did not know the ambitions attached to them. They grew where soil, rain, shade, and temperature allowed. Their roots entered new ground. Their cherries ripened season after season. But around them, human systems determined who owned the trees, who worked among them, and who gained from the harvest. In Java, in the Caribbean, in the Indian Ocean, and later across much of the Americas, coffee became part of a larger colonial world. Ships carried sacks of beans between ports. Ledgers recorded weights and prices. European markets responded to supply and demand. Far from the polished tables of coffeehouses, the labor of many hands supported the growing habit of the cup. And yet, even within this difficult history, there were continuities of skill and knowledge. Coffee cultivation required attention, knowing when cherries were ripe, how to dry beans in changing weather, how to protect plants from disease, how to prepare a crop for sale. Much of that knowledge was held and practiced by workers whose names were not preserved in trade records. Their contributions remain part of coffee's history, even when the documents are silent. As the 18th century gave way to the 19th, coffee was no longer a regional drink tied mainly to Yemen and the Ottoman world. It had become a global crop. Its trees were rooted in many soils. Its trade connected islands, ports, plantations, cities, and households across great distances. From this point, the story moves gently toward the Americas, where coffee would shape mountainsides, economies, labor systems, and national identities for generations. In Brazil, in the Caribbean, in Central America, and in Colombia, the plant would find new landscapes, and people would build new coffee traditions around it, some marked by hardship, some by careful craft, and all part of the long, complex journey of the familiar cup. Chapter 10. Coffee in the Americas. Morning fog often lingers gently over coffee country. It rests in the folds of green mountains, softening the lines of hillsides where coffee trees grow in careful rows. As the light strengthens, the mist begins to lift. Leaves shine with dew. Narrow paths appear between the plants. In the flowering season, small white blossoms open along the branches, carrying a delicate fragrance often compared to jasmine. Later, the flowers give way to green fruit, and then to red coffee cherries, gathered by hand into baskets when they are ripe. In the Americas, coffee found many landscapes where it could grow well. Across the Caribbean, Central America, and South America, the plant adapted to valleys, volcanic slopes, upland farms, and broad estates. Coffee often prefers higher elevations with moderate temperatures, especially the Arabica species, though altitude is only one part of the story. Soil, rainfall, shade, variety, farming skill, and processing all shape the final cup. By the 18th century, coffee was being planted in parts of the Caribbean and Latin America as European demand continued to grow. Through colonial routes and regional exchange, coffee spread across warm regions where colonial powers hoped to produce crops for export. This expansion brought beauty to some landscapes, but it also carried a heavy human cost. Much coffee cultivation in the colonial Americas depended on enslaved labor, forced labor, and unequal systems of land and power. The rows of trees, the drying patios, and the shipping ports cannot be separated from the lives of the people whose work made coffee profitable. To tell the history truthfully is to remember both the plant and the hands that tended it, often under conditions they did not choose. Brazil became the largest coffee store in the Americas. Coffee was introduced there in the 18th century, and by the 19th century Brazil had become the world's leading producer. Vast areas of land were turned toward coffee, especially in regions of southeastern Brazil. The crop shaped railways, ports, towns, fortunes, and political power. Brazil's coffee expansion relied heavily on enslaved labor until slavery was abolished there in 1888. After abolition, coffee production continued, often with immigrant and wage labor, and many workers still faced difficult conditions. The system changed, but inequalities remained in many places. Coffee had become a global commodity, a product traded in large quantities, and its price rose and fell in markets far from the farms where it was grown. Farther north and west, coffee also became central to countries such as Colombia, Guatemala, Costa Rica, El Salvador, and other Latin American nations. Each region developed its own patterns of landholding, labor, export, and identity. In some places, coffee was grown on large estates. Small farms became especially important. Colombia became known around the world for coffee grown in mountainous regions. Its coffee identity is strongly connected with smallholder farming. A smallholder is a farmer who works a relatively small plot of land, often with family labor and local knowledge built over generations. Not all Colombian coffee comes from small farms, but smallholders have played a major role in shaping the country's reputation. On steep slopes, coffee trees may grow beside other plants and shade trees, with paths winding between homes, washing stations, and drying areas. The work of coffee begins long before it reaches a roaster. A farmer watches the trees through seasons of rain, sun, blossom, and fruit. When cherries ripen, pickers often choose only the red ones, returning again and again as more fruit matures. This selective picking is slow work, but it can help produce more even coffee. After harvest comes processing. Processing means turning coffee cherries into dry green coffee beans. Green coffee is not green like a leaf exactly. It's the name for dried, unroasted coffee beans before they are heated and browned by roasting. There are several ways to process coffee, and each can influence flavor. In many Latin American regions, coffee cherries are pulped soon after picking. Pulping removes the outer fruit skin and much of the soft flesh. The beans are still covered in a sticky layer called mucilage. To remove it, the coffee may be placed in water or tanks for fermentation. Fermentation is a natural process in which tiny microorganisms help break down fruit sugars and mucilage. It sounds complicated, but it is a familiar kind of natural change, like the quiet transformation used in many foods. After fermentation, the coffee is washed and spread to dry. On drying patios, beans may lie in pale layers under the sun, turned with wooden rakes so they dry evenly. In other places, raised beds allow air to move around the beans. When rain threatens, workers gather or cover the coffee. When the sun returns, the beans are spread again. Drying takes patience. Too much moisture can damage coffee in storage. Too little care can affect quality. Once dried, the coffee still has a thin protective layer. Hulling removes this layer. Then the beans are sorted by size, density, and appearance. Some sorting is done by machine, and some by careful hands and eyes. The result is green coffee ready to be packed into sacks and sent onward. Only later, often far from the farm, are the beans roasted, ground, and brewed. Roasting brings out the aromas most people recognize as coffee. Warm, toasty, sometimes nutty, sometimes bright or gently sweet. Grinding breaks the roasted beans into small particles. Brewing joins those grounds with water, drawing out flavor into a cup. In many coffee-growing regions of the Americas, the crop became more than an export. It shaped rural calendars, family routines, roads, mills, local markets, and national images. Coffee harvest brought seasonal movement. Prices brought hope in some years and hardship in others. Dependence on global markets could make communities vulnerable, because the value of coffee was often decided by buyers and exchanges far away. Still, amid these larger forces, coffee remained a plant tended branch by branch. In Colombia's Green Mountains, in the highlands of Guatemala, on Costa Rican farms, on Brazilian estates and smaller holdings, on Caribbean hillsides and Central American slopes, the work continued through generations. People learned the timing of blossoms, the signs of ripeness, the feel of properly dried beans, and the quiet importance of clean water, good soil, and steady care. By the time a sack of green coffee left a farm, it carried more than seeds. It carried weather, elevation, labor, land, history, and skill. It traveled by mule, cart, truck, train, river, or ship, moving from rural paths toward warehouses and ports. From there it entered another part of coffee's long journey, toward roasters, shops, restaurants, offices, and kitchens. And as coffee moved into the 19th and 20th centuries, it began to settle more deeply into everyday life. The green beans from distant hills would be roasted in towns and cities, brewed in homes and cafés, poured at counters, and shared during ordinary pauses in the day. Chapter 11. Coffee becomes everyday. By the 19th century, coffee had traveled so far and passed through so many hands that it began to settle into ordinary rooms. It was no longer only a drink of port cities, courtly households, or busy coffeehouses. It was found in kitchens, boarding houses, railway stations, restaurants, offices, and cafés on neighborhood streets. In many places, the story of coffee became less about first arrivals and more about daily rhythms. A kettle warming on a stove, a pot set near the back of a counter, a cup placed beside a newspaper, a quiet pause in the middle of work. The ways people prepared coffee were varied and practical. Some households boiled ground coffee directly in water, letting the grounds sink before pouring. Others used cloth filters, which held back the grounds while the dark liquid passed through. Metal filters appeared too, sturdy and reusable, fitting into pots and pitchers of many shapes. Each method had its own pace. Boiling was simple and direct. Filtering was slower and cleaner. Both belonged to a world in which families adapted tools to habit, budget, fuel, and taste. One of the most familiar devices of the 19th and early 20th centuries was the percolator. A percolator is a coffee pot that cycles hot water through coffee grounds again and again. As the water heats, it rises through a tube, flows over the grounds, and then falls back into the pot below. In many homes, especially in North America, the percolator became part of the soundscape of morning. It made a soft bubbling noise, steady and patient as the water moved through its small metal pathways. A percolator might sit on a stove or later an electric base. Its polished surface reflected the light of the kitchen. Its handle grew warm beneath a cloth or careful hand. For many people, it represented convenience and reliability. It could brew enough coffee for a household, for guests, or for a long table in a meeting room. The flavor could be strong, sometimes very strong, but it suited an age that valued a full pot, ready to pour. At the same time, other inventors and homemakers were searching for gentler ways to make coffee clear and pleasant. In Germany in 1908, a woman named Melita Benz helped popularize the paper coffee filter. She wanted a cup with fewer grounds and less bitterness, and she experimented with paper as a simple barrier between the coffee and the liquid. A paper filter lets water pass through ground coffee while holding back most of the particles. It was a small domestic improvement, but like many such improvements, it spread widely because it solved an everyday problem. From that idea grew a whole family of filter brewing methods. Over time, paper filters found their way into ceramic cones, glass pots, metal baskets, and later electric drip machines. Drip coffee became especially familiar in the United States, where a pot of filtered coffee could wait on a warmer in a kitchen, restaurant, or office. The method was simple to understand. Hot water passed through ground coffee, then through a filter and gathered below. It was a quiet technology, built around gravity, heat, and patience. In another corner of everyday coffee, Italy developed a different rhythm. There, in the early 20th century, espresso took shape. Espresso is concentrated coffee, brewed quickly under pressure. Instead of letting water slowly drip through grounds, espresso machines push hot water through finely ground coffee with force. The result is a small, dense cup, often served at a counter and enjoyed in a brief pause. Espresso did not appear all at once from the work of one person. It evolved through several inventors, patents, and improvements in machines. In 1901, Luigi Bezzera patented an early espresso machine design. Desiderio Pavoni later helped commercialize espresso machines, making them more available to cafés and bars. Early machines used steam pressure, and later designs improved the pressure, temperature, and consistency of the brew. The Italian espresso bar became its own kind of social space. A person might step inside, exchange a few words, drink a small cup, and continue on through the day. The machine stood behind the counter, warm and gleaming, with levers, gauges, and metal fittings. Steam rose softly. Cups rested upside down in neat rows. The preparation was quick, but the culture around it was unhurried in its own way, shaped by custom, greeting, and repetition. As brewing methods multiplied, coffee also became easier to store, ship, and prepare. Instant coffee developed in the early 20th century and became widely known through military use, convenience culture, and large commercial brands. Instant coffee is brewed coffee that has been dried, so it can dissolve again in hot water. It offered speed and portability. A spoonful could be stirred into a cup almost anywhere. In 1938, Nescafé was launched, and it became one of the best-known names in instant coffee. During wartime, soldiers carried instant coffee because it was light, stable, and simple to prepare. Afterward, it entered offices, homes, hotels, and travel bags. It did not replace brewed coffee, but it became another option, suited to moments when ease mattered most. Its place in coffee history reminds us that everyday life is shaped not only by flavor, but also by time, labor, and convenience. Restaurants and diners added another layer to coffee's ordinary presence. In a diner, a thick mug might be filled and refilled from a glass pot with a dark handle. Coffee sat beside eggs, toast, pie, or a folded newspaper. It was poured at counters where travelers rested, workers gathered, and neighbors spoke in low voices. The cup was sturdy, the saucer plain, the service familiar. In such places, coffee became part of public comfort, inexpensive, expected, and shared. Workplaces also made room for coffee. During the 20th century, the coffee break became common, especially in North America and Europe. A coffee break is a short pause during work, often with coffee. It might take place near a factory station, in an office kitchen, beside a vending machine, or around a small table with paper cups and a pot on a hot plate. The pause mattered as much as the drink. It gave people a few minutes to talk, stretch, think, or simply look away from the task before them. These habits did not look the same everywhere. Everyday coffee changed from country to country, and often from household to household. In Italy, the espresso bar became a daily institution. In the United States, filter coffee and diner refills became familiar images. In France, café au lait, coffee with hot milk, belonged to breakfast tables and cafés. In many homes across Europe, Latin America, and beyond, cloth filters, enamel pots, stovetop pots, and other familiar methods had their own loyal place. Electric drip machines hummed on kitchen counters. Office pots waited beside stacks of cups. Cafés served espresso, cappuccino, and brewed coffee to people reading, meeting, or watching the street through a window. Coffee had become not one custom, but many customs, each shaped by local taste and daily need. And still, beneath the machinery and packaging, the older story remained. The beans had been grown somewhere, harvested from cherries, dried, roasted, ground, and brewed. Every ordinary cup carried traces of highland farms, trade routes, invention, labor, and habit. On a kitchen table or office desk, a cup of coffee might look simple. Steam rises, then fades. Light touches the surface. A hand reaches for it almost without thinking. Yet from that familiar place, the view can widen again toward the present day, toward modern cafes and careful roasters, toward questions of fairness and sustainability, and toward the many people whose work still lives quietly inside the contemporary cup. Chapter 12: The Modern Cup. In a quiet roastery, the air is warm and gently fragrant. Green coffee beans, pale and grassy before roasting, turn slowly inside a heated drum. At first they are firm and muted, carrying the memory of farms and hillsides more than the aroma of a finished drink. Then, little by little, they change. Their color deepens. Their scent becomes rounded and toasty. What began as the seed of a red coffee cherry becomes something familiar to people in many corners of the world. Nearby, a roaster listens, watches, and makes careful adjustments. This work is both practical and attentive. Heat, time, and experience all shape the result. In another place, perhaps in a cafe with wooden tables and soft morning light, a barista pours water in slow circles over fresh grounds. In a kitchen, someone measures beans into a small grinder. In an office, a pot is shared. In a mountain town, coffee is prepared close to where it was grown. The modern cup appears in many forms, yet it still carries the long journey behind it. Today, coffee culture is broad and varied. There are global cafes and tiny neighborhood shops, family kitchens and busy restaurants, home espresso machines and simple pour-over cones, traditional pots and modern brewers made of glass, metal, or ceramic. There are roasters who buy coffee from many regions and farmers who experiment with new ways of processing and drying their harvest. There are people who drink coffee quickly on the way to work and people who pause to notice its aroma, its body, and its quiet changes as it cools. One important part of recent coffee history is called specialty coffee. Specialty coffee means coffee valued for its quality, its origin, and the care used in growing, roasting, and preparing it. The word does not mean that every cup must be rare or complicated. At its heart, it points to attention. It asks where the coffee came from, how it was cultivated, how the fruit was processed, how the beans were roasted, and how the drink was brewed. Along with this has come a renewed interest in traceability. Traceability simply means knowing where coffee came from and how it was produced. In earlier centuries, coffee often traveled under broad names: Mocha, Java, Brazil, Colombia, or simply coffee. These names could be useful, but they often hid the people and places behind the beans. Modern traceability may name a country, a region, a cooperative, a farm, a washing station, or a particular lot harvested at a certain time of year. It can help drinkers understand that coffee is not just a dark liquid in a cup, but the result of soil, weather, labor, skill, and trade. In a specialty cafe, a menu might describe coffees from different regions with different qualities. These descriptions are not fixed rules. Coffee flavor depends on many things: the variety of plant, the elevation, the climate, the harvest, the processing method, the roast, and the brewing. Still, they remind us that coffee is agricultural. Like apples, tea, grapes, or cacao, it carries signs of where and how it grew. Yet the modern coffee story is not only about flavor. It is also about fairness, land, income, and care for the future. Coffee has long moved through unequal supply chains, where farmers may receive only a small portion of the final price. Many small farmers face changing market prices, rising costs, and uncertain weather. In response, different movements and systems have developed. Fair trade is one of these. Fair trade is a certification system intended to support better trading conditions for producers, often through standards and pricing structures. Direct trade is another approach. Direct trade means closer buying relationships between roasters and producers, sometimes with more communication, more transparency, and prices negotiated more directly. Organic certification focuses on farming without certain synthetic chemicals. Shade-grown coffee refers to coffee grown under trees rather than in open full sun, a practice that can support birds, insects, soil health, and a more diverse farm environment. These efforts can help, and many farmers, cooperatives, roasters, and buyers have used them in meaningful ways. But they do not solve every problem. Certifications can cost money and time. Direct relationships depend on trust, access, and stable markets. A higher price for one harvest may not protect a farmer from every future difficulty. Sustainability, a word often used today, means trying to protect people, land, and resources over time. In coffee, sustainability is not a single simple answer. It is a continuing practice made of many choices. Coffee farming itself faces real challenges. Climate change, which means long-term shifts in temperature and weather patterns, is changing where coffee can grow well. Some areas are becoming warmer or less predictable. Rains may arrive differently than they once did. Droughts, storms, or unusual seasons can affect flowering, fruit development, and harvests. Farmers may need to choose different varieties, improve shade cover, conserve water, or change how they manage the soil. There are also plant diseases. One of the best known is coffee leaf rust, a fungal disease that harms coffee plants. Coffee leaf rust appears on leaves and can weaken the tree, reducing the harvest. It has affected farms in many regions, especially when conditions favor its spread. Managing it can require careful farm practices, resistant plant varieties, and support for growers who may not have many resources. The two most widely known coffee species are Arabica and Robusta. Arabica, the species with roots in the highlands of Ethiopia and nearby regions, is often prized for delicate and varied flavors. It tends to prefer cooler highland environments, and it can be sensitive to heat, disease, and changing conditions. Robusta is generally hardier. It often grows better at lower elevations, contains more caffeine, and can be more resistant to some stresses. For a long time, Robusta was often spoken of as lower quality, but that is too simple. Like Arabica, Robusta can be grown and processed with care. It is different, and its role in the future of coffee may become increasingly important. Across the coffee world, many producers are adapting with patience and knowledge. Some are planting shade trees to protect soil and create cooler growing conditions. Some are improving processing, the steps that turn coffee cherries into dry green beans. Processing may involve removing the fruit, fermenting the sticky layer around the seed, washing, drying, hulling, and sorting. Small changes in these steps can influence quality and reduce waste. Others are focusing on biodiversity, which means a healthy variety of plants, animals, and living organisms in a place. A farm with different trees, ground cover, insects, birds, and soil life can be more resilient than a bare field of one crop. Soil health matters deeply. So does water conservation. In many places, producers are finding ways to care for land and water while continuing the work of growing coffee. At the same time, people who roast, sell, and drink coffee are learning to see the cup more fully. A roaster may visit farms, taste harvest samples, and pay prices that reflect quality and labor. A cafe may explain the origin of its coffee without turning it into a performance. A home brewer may choose beans with curiosity, knowing that each bag has traveled through many hands. These choices are small by themselves, but they belong to a larger movement toward respect. Coffee remains one of the world's most widely consumed beverages and an important agricultural product. It is grown across the tropics, traded across oceans, roasted in towns and cities, and prepared in countless ways. It supports livelihoods, shapes landscapes, and fills ordinary rooms with a familiar aroma. Its history includes hospitality and conversation, but also empire and exploitation. Its present includes pleasure and craft, but also uncertainty and responsibility. To hold both truths is part of understanding coffee clearly. And so at the end of this long journey, we return to a simple cup. Within it, if we imagine gently, there is a shaded forest in the Ethiopian highlands, where glossy leaves hold red cherries in the mist. There are Yemeni terraces, stepped carefully into dry mountainsides. There is the harbor of Mocha, with sacks of beans resting in the shade. There are small cups in Ottoman homes, newspapers on European coffeehouse tables, drying patios in the Americas, quiet kitchens, diners, offices, espresso bars, and modern cafes filled with soft light. There are also the hands gathering cherries, sorting beans, tending soil, guiding water, turning a roast, grinding, brewing, pouring, and sharing. Across centuries, coffee has passed from hand to hand, changing as it traveled, yet keeping something steady at its center. It has been a drink of wakefulness, welcome, work, conversation, memory, and craft. A modern cup does not contain the whole past in a literal way, but it can remind us of it. It can invite a little gratitude for the plant, the land, the labor, and the long chain of human care that brings a familiar warmth to the table. From forest to terrace, from port to household, from farm to roastery, from one person to another, coffee continues its quiet passage through the world.